Jung wasn't a pastor, theologian, preacher, or spiritual leader. Above all, he was a psychiatrist, a scientist of the human soul, and a deep explorer of the psyche's hidden depths. Yet throughout his life, he reached a timeless conclusion that goes beyond culture and religion. The image of God is engraved in the human soul. For Jung, God wasn't just a belief or concept, but a living reality within the unconscious. Not something outside of us, but something inside that reveals itself through symbols, dreams, moments of awareness, and even in times of crisis. It's a presence that calls us toward truth, and if ignored, silently consumes us from within at a time when science sought to erase any trace of spirituality. Jung had the courage to declare, God is one of the most powerful ideas ever to inhabit the human mind, and as such, acts with real force in a person's life. What did he mean? That the divine isn't distant or detached. It's active, present, and internal. It's not confined by dogmas, but is accessible through deep, soulful experiences. For Jung, finding God is, above all, remembering who you really are. He called this process individuation, the journey of becoming your true self at the core of your being. According to him, this only happens when we connect with the self, the center of the soul, the deepest point of the psyche. This self is the divine spark within us, the place where the human and the eternal meet. That's why Jung believed it wasn't enough to study behavior. We had to understand the soul, because God either reveals or retreats there. When God falls silent, emptiness takes hold, anxiety rises, and identity starts to unravel. Jung warned that the greatest suffering of the 20th century would be this loss of meaning. Today, millions distract themselves but don't truly know themselves. Thousands stay busy but never connect deeply. There are many active bodies, but sleeping souls. That's why Jung said deep healing begins with a question: what image of God lives inside you? We all carry one, even if unconscious, distorted by trauma, fear, or rigid beliefs. For some, God means judgment, for others, silence, and for others, absence. But Jung discovered something radical. When the inner image of God is distorted, our emotional life falls out of balance. Yet when that image is healed, the soul begins to bloom. This restoration doesn't come from rehearsed sermons or imposed rules. It happens in the silence, in inner confrontation, in honest searching, and often through pain. Jung wrote, "The most authentic religious experience usually begins when everything we once held as certain falls apart. It's in collapse that the soul starts to listen. It's in darkness that the inner light begins to shine." For this reason, Jung saw the unconscious as sacred, not just a storage of repressed memories, but a living temple where symbols, archetypes, and divine images express themselves to those who have eyes to see. Have you ever stopped to ask which voice is guiding your life? Are you trying to control everything with your rational mind? And in doing so, have you distanced yourself from your deepest guidance? The God within you. For Jung, reconnecting with this inner presence is an act of spiritual courage. It's not easy, fast, or guaranteed, but it's real and it changes everything. When you access this inner God, something shifts in how you live. You act less out of fear and more out of truth, less out of comparison and more out of mission, less out of obligation and more out of meaning. You start to sense a greater force guiding you from inside, a force that doesn't need to shout because it whispers with authority, a direction that doesn't push but draws you with purpose. For many, this is the moment of awakening, when they finally realize God was never far away but has always been inside, waiting to be heard. If this message is stirring something within you, maybe it's no coincidence. Maybe it's God whispering again, "I'm here. I have always been. Now that you've silenced the outside world, can you hear me?" Jung noticed that even in the most distant and ancient cultures, there was always a central figure, a symbol, and energy, a spiritual guide. He called this center the self. But the self isn't the superficial I you show the world. It's not the ego, nor the image you present on social media. It's something deeper, older, wiser. It's the soul's core, the silent compass, the voice that persists even when everything else seems to collapse. For Jung, the self represents the God within us. Not an idea we learn, but a presence that has always existed. It shows up in dreams that wake us with messages, in intuition that steers us away from mistakes, in coincidences that feel like divine scripts, and in that restless feeling we get when we live a life that isn't truly ours. While the ego wants control, the self invites surrender. While the ego seeks approval, the self calls for authenticity. While the ego builds walls, the self breaks down defenses so truth can emerge. Jung said, "The self is like a spark of God at the center of the psyche. It doesn't command or shout, it calls. Ignoring that call has a price: the existential void, the unexplained exhaustion, the outwardly successful life that still feels empty. Often, illness, crisis, loss, or emotional breakdown aren't enemies, but calls from the self urging the soul to return to its center. It's God saying, 'You have lost yourself. Now is the time to return.' But returning takes courage because the self isn't comfortable. It challenges you, demands silence, and questions the patterns the ego calls a good life, which are often just cleverly disguised traps. The journey toward the self, Jung said, is the true spiritual path. It's where the ego bows down, where masks fall away, and where a new identity is born, not one shaped by the outside world, but rooted in eternal purpose." Carl Jung spent years listening to people who seemed to have everything but felt empty inside. People who smiled on the outside but carried silent screams within. Powerful men afraid to sleep. Strong women quietly crying because they didn't know who they really were. He realized suffering isn't a mistake to fix, but a doorway, a crack through which the self, the soul's center, tries to emerge. Healing only comes when we face our pain head on, he said. Everything we avoid inside will return as fate. And here is the question: if God is within me, why does he sometimes fall silent? Jung answered this with clarity. God's silence is the soul beginning to listen. When everything falls apart, masks drop. When all certainties dissolve, the true search begins, not for quick answers or formulas, but for meaning. It's easy to talk about faith when life is smooth, but faith is truly tested in chaos. More than that, in chaos, faith stops being an idea. It becomes flesh, a choice, an inner voice. Jung saw evil as part of the whole human experience, not something outside us, but something inside waiting for awareness. The shadow, as he called it, consists of everything we deny, repress, or pretend not to see. Ignoring the shadow doesn't make us holier, it only makes us weaker. The evil we don't integrate becomes projection. We see in others what we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. We judge the world to avoid facing the mirror. Here lies one of Jung's greatest lessons. You don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by bringing the darkness into awareness. This doesn't mean embracing evil, but recognizing it's real and refusing to be controlled by it in the shadows. It means understanding that good and evil both dwell in the human soul, and that God's presence teaches us how to choose to when God seems silent. Maybe he's simply giving us space to grow, space to decide, space to listen. Maybe the silence you feel isn't absence, but waiting. God waits for you to let go of control, to humble yourself, to stop running from pain and ask, "What is this trying to teach me?" Jung said, "The encounter with the self often comes as a collapse, because only when the ego breaks can the soul begin to breathe." How many times have you felt lost in the dark, praying but hearing nothing, acting without direction, living without meaning? And yet in that silence, something started to shift. a new insight, an unexpected strength, a kind of faith not learned from books but born from the abyss. That's the kind of spirituality Jung respected. Faith born in the desert, growing through crisis, hearing God's voice even when it seems silent. Because sometimes God speaks in the pause, the delay, the mistake, the ending, the breaking. Things you don't understand now, but will one day look back on and realize. There, God taught me more than in 1,000 words. Suffering is a call, but only those who listen awaken. Only those who cross through transform. Only those who surrender are reborn. If you're walking this valley, feeling God distant, if what once made sense now feels gray, maybe you're closer to God than ever before, because it is there, at your lowest point, that He reveals Himself anew, not as a God who fixes everything outside, but as a God who restores everything inside. When you start hearing God within, something changes. It's not from the outside in, but from the inside out. The world keeps roaring with noise, chaos, and rush, but you begin to walk in peace because now there's a living presence inside you. Carl Jung called this state integration. It's when the ego, the shadow, the unconscious, and the self stop fighting and start working together. It's when the soul stops running, the ego stops lying, and the self begins to lead with clarity. Jung said, "The goal of life is not perfection, but wholeness. To be complete is to be fully human with all your parts reconciled. And God is the process that transforms this reconciliation into meaning." In other words, the purpose isn't to become a saint, but to become whole. To live with truth, walk with awareness, and exist with harmony between what you believe, feel, say, and do. That is the real miracle, being guided by a voice that no longer falls silent. When this connection happens, life doesn't get easier, but it becomes aligned. You no longer rush to prove something. You don't accept just any path. You don't sell yourself for praise, status, or money. You live with direction. Jung believed this direction is God working through us. And the more you walk with the self, the more you find meaning even in the simplest tasks. Choices become clearer, relationships gain purpose, and even silence deepens. But this peace doesn't show up suddenly. It's built day by day, decision by decision. That's why Jung emphasized the importance of mindful attention to your inner life. He said if you don't watch over your soul, the world takes control. You end up reacting to everything, trying to please everyone, dragged by others' expectations. But when God is alive in you, you stop being a prisoner. You become presence, a firm, calm, intentional presence. And here's an important point. When this happens, you become an answer. You stop searching so much for what to do and start being who you are. This changes everything around you. Jung said a truly integrated person transforms their environment just by being in it because they radiate peace, carry depth, speak less, and say more. At this point in the journey, God is no longer just a belief, but an expression. You become part of the divine movement in the world through your words, your choices, your way of listening, your way of loving, serving, and building. This is living faith. That's why Jung saw individuation, the process of becoming whole, as a spiritual, psychological, and practical path, inseparable from life itself, reflected in your work, family, mission, and silence. Because a soul that has found God doesn't need to prove anything. It reveals balance in a confusing world, presence in a distracted world, coherence in a world of masks. And the most beautiful thing, this soul heals, inspires, shows the way, and lives in a way others recognized. There's something different there, and that something is God. Maybe without realizing it, you're becoming this person, not because you know everything, but because you're listening. Not because you're perfect, but because you chose to walk with the self, chose to let God live in you, not as an idea, but as a purpose if everything we've talked about here has sparked something in you. Then close this cycle with the certainty that this journey is real. It begins in chaos, crosses silence, faces the shadow, but ends with light, wholeness, and peace. The peace of those who no longer need to seek outside because they found within the presence they were missing. If this touched you deeply, comment, "I am listening." This simple but living phrase is a symbol. It's the affirmation that even with fear, doubts, and falls, you've chosen to listen to the deepest voice, the voice that calls you by name, the voice that doesn't accuse but welcomes, the voice that doesn't demand but awakens, the voice that doesn't impose but guides, the voice of God within you. If this content spoke to you, if in any way it awakened your consciousness or calmed the noise of your mind, then this channel is for you. Subscribe now to Emotional Without Barriers, activate notifications, and keep walking with us toward a more authentic, clear, and connected life with who you truly are. Together, we'll go beyond thoughts and meet again in the silence of the soul. See you in the next video.